Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And also by the generous support of listeners like you who choose to support us at Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the band was speckled and there were 6 Napoleons, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about why Dr. Watson was called James by his wife? Or of Sherlock Holmes's dining habits? Or what happened when he let a criminal escape?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 342, 221B, Baker Street. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the minutiae in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And are you the A or B side of Burt Wolder?
I'm the sunny side of Burt Wolder. Everybody knows that.
Always sunny side up.
Yeah, and that's why every morning a little warm bacon fat makes sure that the top of my head is fully cooked.
Everyone needs bacon fat.
Yes. Although my hats keep sliding off.
Well, look, whatever you do, when you render your bacon fat, make sure it's kosher for Passover.
Doesn't that depend on how we kill it? No, probably not. Never mind.
Well, we are about to embark on a new quarter's worth of master's class episodes. If you recall, in the 2 previous quarters, we covered authors Trevor Hall and Edgar W. Smith, respectively. Now we're going to enter into the territory of Michael Harrison. This is going to be quite an adventure because, as we were discussing before the show began, Michael was a character, and we're going to tell you a little bit about him as well as his perspective. And this particular episode, we're going to look at the lodgings at 221B Baker Street. I know this is a topic we've covered before in various aspects here on Trifles, but to hear it from the pen of Michael Harrison, or to read it from the pen of Michael Harrison, is a unique experience, one that I think we'll all enjoy in this case.
We better.
Yes, indeed. Well, the show notes for this episode, including a link to In the Footsteps of Sherlock Holmes, where we're taking this commentary from, can be found at ihose.co/trifles342, all lowercase. And that'll bring you to the Sherlock Holmes podcast.com website. And there you can find anything associated with the show that you like, including the ability to sign up for email updates and to support the show on Patreon. As a reminder, all of our patrons have the opportunity to participate. Well, actually, you don't have the opportunity. You are ruthlessly thrown into our monthly and quarterly drawings. Whether you like it or not, you will be eligible to win a prize. Monthly winners get a back copy of the Baker Street Journal, and quarterly winners get an annual subscription to the Baker Street Journal. So just check that out at patreon.com/trifles or directly on our website. Well, as promised, we are going to step into the footsteps of Sherlock Holmes. This is a book written by Michael Harrison. Looks like at least the components of it were originally written in 1958, copyrighted 1958. The book we are working from is from Frederick Fell Publishers from 1960. But Bert, why don't you give us a little bit of background on just who Michael Harrison was?
He was you said he was a great character. He really was. But he was, in my estimation, he was a great man. He's somebody who made a big impression on me when I met him when I was in my early 30s and got to know him a bit. He was born in 1907, and his real name wasn't Michael Harrison. It was Maurice Desmond Rohan. And he's an Englishman. He served briefly in military intelligence during World War II, and he published a series of novels and then turned to writing detective fiction. And we're dealing today with one of his great Sherlockian books, In the Footsteps of Sherlock Holmes. But Michael was born in 1907, and from his perspective, for the first 20 years of his life, the stories of Sherlock Holmes were appearing for the first time in the Strand magazine. And so when Michael looked back in Sherlockian scholarship, his perspective was different from people like Trevor Hall or even Edgar Smith and S.C. Roberts and H.W. Bell. Michael was looking back on it as you might look back on your own 20s and remember how much things cost, what the sense of being in the city was like. And that really comes through in his paper. He was a wonderful character, spent a lot of time in the United States among Sherlockians. And if you look at, he was invested in the Irregulars in 1964. And if you look at his background, you will find out, among other things, that Michael was named Duke of Sant Estrella by the Kingdom of Redonda in 1951. And
that sounds redundant.
It does sound. He was probably named twice. He was probably named the Duke twice.
Where is the Kingdom of Redonda?
The Kingdom of Redonda is exactly where you left it. I mean, come on.
Well,
these places don't move around.
No, they don't. It's a micronation associated with the tiny uninhabited Caribbean island of Redonda. It lies between Nevis and Montserrat in the West Indies. It's legally it's a dependency on the country of Antigua and Barbuda.
Oh, really? Well, that's interesting. Excellent. Well, anyway, Michael gives us in 1958, in this book, which is when it was published, his view of the rooms at Baker Street. And this is the 10th chapter in the Footsteps of Sherlock Holmes. And again, this is a fellow who's looking back in his 20s to experiences he had in his 20s for somebody in the 1950s and 60s. So he says, well, let's take a look at this. He goes back to a study in Scarlet and says, there's a reference in Study in Scarlet, a couple of comfortable bedrooms, a single large airy sitting room, illuminated by two broad windows. That reference to broad windows is curious, for all the windows of the houses on Baker Street, and Michael is speaking with some experience here, are of the same width. It's in their height that they vary. So we have to understand that when Watson says broad, he's probably meaning larger than the windows of the floors above. And that was a characteristic of a variety of architectural styles, whereas you go up on a dwelling of 3 or 4 stories, the windows on the higher floors are a bit smaller, a bit less high, let's say, than the ones below. And he says, the drawing room floor of an old Baker Street house does, in fact, boast very tall windows. And for many references elsewhere than in a Study in Scarlet, it's obvious that the two men had at least a part of a drawing room on, what we in England would call the first floor at 221B Baker Street. And then he says, and the abrupt appearance of so many clients can only mean that it was possible to enter Holmes's sitting room almost directly from the street. That is to say, after having come up a pair of stairs and walked along a short passage to the door of the sitting room. And so let me make this quite clear. He says the door on the street was usually left open. A visitor entered the house, walked straight up and knocked on the door of the sitting room, or in the case of Grimsby Roylott, burst right in. And this is one of the wonderful things about Michael's perspective, because he produces these sorts of observations that you really don't find in any other writer, any other commentary on the canon.
Yeah, and the thing is, it may seem almost like background noise at this point. Thinking about the layout, the size, etc., of the rooms at 221B Baker Street. But let's not forget, you think about at least the appearance of 221B in popular culture, say on television, and particularly at that time in films. There really wasn't a consistent layout to Holmes's rooms, nor was there really any, shall we say, faithfulness to Conan Doyle's writing. It was usually constructed as a set piece. We were viewing almost a cutaway of the sitting rooms as it would have been. And it wasn't until we got to the mid-1980s with the Granada production starring Jeremy Brett that I think we find the first faithful recreation of the layout of the sitting rooms and the bedrooms at Baker Street. And what Harrison is doing here is really setting the stage for what we now simply observe as fact. No one before that time really spent a lot of time considering the layout.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation, and I really agree with you about the Granada sitting room. The other one that comes to mind is to my mind, being really authentic, is the one from The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, where Billy Wilder had enough money at the time so that they could actually sort of build a building. As I remember, they just constructed a building with incredible furniture on the studio lot. But I think you're certainly right. And Michael goes on and talks about the arrangement of the sitting room and deals nicely with some of the weird things. You just mentioned the inconsistencies in the description of the sitting room, in the inconsistencies that came up, for example, in the Mazarin Stone. He says, Mazarin Stone mentions a bow window in the sitting room, but this may well be an error. Yeah, and I think that's right. He says there are still one or two bow windows in Baker Street, but they're all of a later date. And they might have been fitted by some individualistic tenant. And here's a lovely observation from Michael, but in view of the strict covenant imposed by the ground landlord, the Portman estate, such abnormal fenestration is unlikely. Now, the fact is that in Marylebone and about 100 acres of the West End, that's all owned by the Portman estate. And when you get a flat or a building within that territory, you're not owning the property. You're getting basically a leasehold. And that goes back to the 16th century. And so Michael, is pointing that out. Again, such an observation that I don't know has been frequently, if ever, pointed out by other commentaries.
And by the way, Abnormal Fenestration, that's a great band name.
Oh, wouldn't that be great? I'd listen to the Abnormal Fenestration.
It's a window into my soul.
Oh, window. Oh, that's great. So he goes on, and Michael takes us through Watson's room on the floor above Holmes's, because he talks about Holmes being on this first floor, Holmes' bedroom being on the same floor as the sitting room that both of the men shared, and where the communicating doors were. And, takes us down to the Six Napoleons, which says, Holmes, by this point, the Six Napoleons could be fairly said to have reached the top of the professional ladder. And so these references to our humble room and modest apartment and our little sitting room, might not be taken at face value, because, of course, Holmes, in the case of with the Duke of Holderness, got a substantial check. And he'd turned down a knighthood and been honored by several reigning monarchs. And, Michael...
That could be a home improvement fund for Holmes if you wanted to change the layout of 221B at all.
Yeah, and he was a great researcher, so he ends this sort of section by saying, if in fact, as some people like Gavin Brand have suggested, that the real location of 221B is the original 61 Baker Street, Then the shop was divided between Miss Frances Williams, the dressmaker, and Miss Effie Hill, a court dressmaker.
Well, it could be a pseudonym for Mrs. Hudson. Who knows?
Yeah, it could be.
Well, let's pause here to think on that, about the construction of 221B Baker Street. And when we come back after this quick word, we'll continue our look at Michael Harrison's work.
When you're looking for reference material regarding the Sherlock Holmes stories, the Baker Street Journal has been providing thoughtful articles since 1946. The topics range from the trifling to deep conundrums, but they all center around Sherlockian scholarship. And maybe you've been subscribing for years, or maybe you have yet to subscribe. But there's one resource that can make your research easier to do: the EBSJ. The EBSJ is an electronic copy of all the back issues of the Baker Street Journal from its inception in 1946 through 2011 in PDF format. That's 276 issues with more than 18,000 pages, spanning the old series to the new series, the Christmas annuals, all the way through 2011. It's entirely searchable, so you can find what you need in just seconds. Check out the EBSJ on BakerStreetIrregulars.com today.
Okay, we're back. We're just thinking about what the ground floor of Mrs. Hudson's lodgings might have included. Gavin Brand had helpfully suggested at 61 Baker Street, dressmaker and court dressmaker. So, but he says it's hard to reconcile Watson's mention of Holmes's cat-like neatness, and here we're getting into the way they kept their rooms at 221B Baker Street, with the description of Holmes's domestic habits. You know, you've got the VR pattern of bullet pox on the wall, which makes you wonder what the Portman estate might have thought of abuse of their property that way, but I don't think they were necessarily concerned with the inside as much as they were with the outward appearance. And the tobacco and the Persian slipper, the bills with the open jackknife on the mantel shelf. And Harrison says the explanation is that Holmes, like any other man, was excessively neat in his appearance, not only in the street, but excessively untidy in the house. And boy, does that resonate, Bert. I don't know about you.
You mean you're not wearing your dinner jacket as we're recording?
Well, no, because it's before lunchtime.
Oh, good. I only wear a T-shirt and cummerbund. You know, you have to keep up some appearances.
Well, you got to catch those crumbs somehow.
Yes. Now, finance may have had something to do with all of this. Clothes may have been cheaper in those days. That is to say, any sort of clothes, but good clothes were as dear relatively as they are today. A man who valued his appearance as much as Holmes did would have been forced to look after his clothes. And bear in mind that one hears of piles of old newspapers at Baker Street, but you never hear about jackets or shirts lying around. And someone who had to care for his clothes because he couldn't afford to do otherwise might have sought some emotional relief by overemphasizing his untidiness where no harm could be done. Although Mrs. Hudson and the neighbors must have been very patient to put up with revolver shooting and the marking of the wall. And, by the way, a revolver cost in those days around £5, around 1880. And Holmes may have felt that having paid so much, he ought to be able to try it out.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's no record, at least, that we've seen of there being shooting ranges in London at the time. So, I mean, where else would a gentleman be able to practice his pistol shots?
Oh, that's interesting. I wonder if, I just don't know this. I wonder if if Scotland Yarders, they must have been trained. And I mean, of course, they didn't carry weapons, but they must have been trained in their use, one would think. Well, there must have been a pistol range in Scotland Yard somewhere. Interesting.
Somewhere in a basement, I would imagine. But with regard to clothes, remember that Holmes and Watson were seeking desirable terms at Baker Street, Harrison writes, and that means they had to look after their pence. Watson told us of his 11 and 6 a day, and Holmes, as we know, could not have taken the rooms at Baker Street unless he could have found Watson to share the expenses. And even in those days, there were good craftsmen at a price a little less than the ordinary. We must bear this in mind in looking back to a period so very like and yet so very different from our own, that the money saved on each outfit, as compared with the present prices, was more than offset by the inescapable social necessity of having the proper garment for each occasion. I want to pause there a moment because, again, remember where Harrison is coming from. He was born in 1907, just scarcely a generation after the first appearance of Sherlock Holmes. And he lived out yet another generation until the demise of, well, not Sherlock Holmes, but of Arthur Conan Doyle. So he was kind of in the moment. He understood exactly the social classes, the need to keep up appearances, etc. That meant Holmes and Watson needing to dress for particular occasions, dressing for the theater, dressing for dinner, dressing for receiving august personages at Baker Street, as well as the regular streetwear. So it's a really interesting position that Michael Harrison holds to be able to understand and translate the world in which Sherlock Holmes lived.
Yeah, very much so. He observes, even as late as a few years after World War I, we find Lady Trowbridge, in her famous Book of Etiquette, solemnly warning her male readers against the wearing of brown boots in London, unless you wish to earn the sneer of the footman. Now, what does that say about Henry Baskerville, who got his tan boots? Yeah, we talked about that some time ago. And Michael observes Holmes was sensitive, by the way. He could be sensitive to the point of almost petulant touchiness in matters of social etiquette. Because, after all, he was unhappy when he spoke to Baron von Gruner, Adalbert von Gruner, for not prefacing Holmes with Mr. He wasn't called Mr. Holmes by the evil Baron. And so Holmes would hardly be likely to wear the wrong clothes for a particular occasion. And we know Holmes possessed a full wardrobe. He had at least one set of many civil uniforms, and that every reasonably well-dressed man needed in the London at the point Michael is writing 77 years ago. He had short-coated suits, frock-coated suits, morning-coated suits, town and traveling overcoats, tweed suits, headgear to match, topper, billycock, tweed, the deerstalker, and so on.
Boy, it sounds like Holmes could have used his own Jeeves.
Where did he keep all this? That's the issue. We know he had different locations throughout the city where he could change his appearance. But, there's not much closet space there are lumber rooms in Baker Street, but in those days, you had wardrobes and things like that to fit your clothing into.
See, this is why he needed to keep newspapers strewn about, because it actually covered up the suits that were underneath them.
Yes. Are you done with that issue of the Times, Watson? I'm thinking of going for a walk.
Oh, but Harrison tells us that this finicky attention that Holmes had with the details of his wardrobe could be seen by his attitude towards Lord Holdhurst's economizing in the matter of his boots. Remember, Holmes says, we're now going to interview Lord Holdhurst, the cabinet minister and future premier of England. And at the conclusion of the interview, he says, he's a fine fellow. But he has to struggle to keep up his position. He's far from rich and has many calls. You noticed, of course, that his boots had been resold. Now, what then did Holmes spend on his clothes at the time that he first took up residence in London? He did not, we may presume, go to Henry Poole in the Savile Row, but he might have gone to a tailor in the slightly under top class, say W. Shingleton of 60 New Bond Street, who was a well-known tailor of the day. Shingleton used to advertise ulsters from £2 2 shillings, but an ulster of good Irish frieze would cost at least half as much again. A dress suit at Shingleton's cost from 5 guineas upwards, a frock suit the same, and a morning suit was slightly less, being obtainable in the cheapest quality cloth at 4 guineas. A good pair of handmade boots need not have cost more than 1 guinea. And Harrison says, you'll remember that even as late as 1899, Sir Henry Baskerville mentions that the pair of boots which one boot has been stolen cost him 24 6 in the Strand.
Yeah, that's 24 shillings and sixpence. So that's less for our listeners. That's less than a guinea. First-class linen shirts cost from 8 shillings sixpence to 10 shillings each. Sampson and Company on Oxford Street advertised surplus shirts at 45 shillings and 57 shillings a dozen. Now, the surplus, I find my memory of all this is the surplus shirt, unlike the shirt we have today that buttons from the nape of the neck all the way down to the bottom, only buttoned from about, the chest bone up, and you sort of pulled it on over your head, if I'm remembering that correctly in the 19th century. And paper collars could be bought at a penny each. Linen collars at 4 cents to 6 cents. Each were de rigueur, with so spruce a dresser as Holmes.
Yeah, and Harrison just concludes this section by saying that reminding us about the application of machinery to manufacture clothing that had made no great strides by 1880. The drop in prices was yet to come, and prices in 1880 were relatively greater than they are today, even after 2 disastrously impoverishing wars. An economic fact to be borne in mind is this: while unskilled labor was very cheap indeed, skilled labor, whether of the artisan or of the artist, was better paid relative to the value of money than it is at present. So, and that concludes this chapter of In the Footsteps of Sherlock Holmes. It's just again, you made this note at the beginning, toward the beginning of the episode, Bert, that Harrison really inhabited a unique perch from which to be able to make these observations.
He did, and that's the very enjoyable thing about reading some of Michael's Sherlockian writings, because he makes those times live again effortlessly in presenting these details, all based on his personal experience. He just takes you back down to the life on the street, and just in a few paragraphs, you're sort of there in Baker Street. And that's a big aspect of these commentaries, these people like Michael and Edgar and Trevor Hall, because, the best of them are almost or as enjoyable as reading the cases of Sherlock Holmes, because they're a continuation of that world.
And they certainly are. And we will continue this exploration of Michael Harrison in next month's Master's Class. A reminder, that's the 3rd episode of the month. And in the very next episode, this will be our final episode of the month, which means it's time for our drawing for our Patreon supporters. So make sure you are supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/trifles. We have extra content, and you're able to listen ad-free, as well as to be eligible to win the prize. So that, I suppose, is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Indeed, Doctor. Please take a seat.
I shall do nothing of the kind.